What happens when the people who built a war machine start to quietly turn against the man who ordered it? And what happens when that anger comes not from protesters in the street, but from the regime's own loyal voices? If this story pulls you in the way it pulled me in, hit that subscribe button before we start, because what you're about to hear is not rumor. It is a pattern built from real reporting, and it is growing fast. Let's start with something simple and painfully human. A line of cars stretching for a kilometer, waiting outside a petrol station somewhere in Russia. People sitting in their cars for hours, engines off to save fuel, just to fill a tank that used to take 5 minutes. This is not a scene from a struggling country far away. This is happening right now, inside Russia in 2026, in the 5th year of a war that its own government insists is going exactly according to plan. To understand how a country with some of the largest oil reserves on Earth ended up with empty gas stations, you have to understand what has been happening quietly for the past year. Ukraine shifted its strategy. Instead of only fighting on the front line, Ukrainian forces began a sustained campaign of long-range drone strikes aimed directly at Russia's oil refineries. According to documented timelines of the conflict, Ukraine had struck Russian oil facilities more than 300 times since the war began, with the overwhelming majority of those strikes happening in just the last 2 years as the campaign intensified. What started as a handful of strikes each year became dozens per month by the middle of 2025, and by the summer of 2026, it had become the most serious fuel crisis Russia has faced in over a quarter century. Independent estimates vary, but they all point in the same painful direction for the Kremlin. Some analysts believe close to 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been knocked offline at various points during this campaign. Even the more conservative estimates from organizations like the International Energy Agency still describe a meaningful chunk of the country's fuel production capability sitting damaged or completely shut down. One of the most symbolic strikes hit the Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya, a facility responsible for a huge share of the capital region's gasoline and around half of its diesel supply. Industry sources cited by Reuters believe that refinery will not be back in full operation before the end of the year. Now think about what that actually means for daily life. This is not an abstract economic statistic sitting in a government report somewhere. It is teachers being sent to gas stations in Siberia to help calm down arguments in fuel lines. It is farmers in some of Russia's richest agricultural regions unable to get enough diesel to run their harvesters during the short window when crops need to be collected. It is families quietly noticing that groceries cost more every single month, even while state statistics insist inflation is under control. If you are starting to see why this story matters far beyond Russia's borders, tap the like button right now, because the next part of this video is where things get genuinely surprising. Here's the twist that makes this story different from a normal wartime hardship story. The loudest complaints are not coming from opposition figures or human rights groups. They are coming from people who have spent years defending this war publicly, some of the regime's own most visible supporters, military bloggers and pro-war commentators who built their entire public identity around backing this invasion from day one. This detail matters enormously, and here's why. When a government critic complains about a war, that is expected. Nobody in power is surprised by it, and frankly, nobody in power is usually threatened by it either. But when your own most passionate supporters start openly complaining, using words like catastrophe, collapse, and failure, that tells you something very different is happening beneath the surface. These are not people trying to bring the government down. Many of them are frustrated precisely because they still believe in the war, and they feel that mismanagement, corruption, and denial from officials are actively hurting the cause they support. This kind of criticism from inside the system is sometimes called elite fracture, and it is one of the most closely watched signals analysts use to understand the internal health of a government during wartime. It does not mean collapse is coming. It does mean cracks are visible in places that used to look completely solid. Let's talk about where else that pressure is showing up, because the fuel crisis is only one part of a much bigger picture. Drone warfare has also reached deep into Russian civilian life in ways that were unthinkable in the early years of the war. Reports have documented hundreds of drone incidents striking the Moscow region alone within a single year, something that would have sounded like fiction back when this war first began. Cities that Russian officials once described as completely safe, far from any front line, have had to deal with air raid warnings, damaged infrastructure, and canceled public events. Even Victory Day celebrations, one of the most symbolically important dates on Russia's national calendar, were scaled back in some areas due to security concerns tied to drone activity. There is also an economic angle to this drone campaign that goes beyond oil. Reports have described strikes affecting logistics and warehouse infrastructure connected to major Russian retail and delivery companies, adding billions of dollars in losses, on top of the direct military and energy-related damage. When strikes start hitting the supply chains that deliver everyday goods to ordinary citizens, The war stops being something that happens somewhere else on a map. It becomes something that shows up in delayed deliveries, empty shelves, and rising prices at the checkout counter. And then there's the money itself, which tells its own quiet story, often more honestly than any public statement ever could. According to financial reporting, some of Russia's wealthiest business figures have reportedly been moving significant amounts of money out of the country over the past year, funneling it through informal channels rather than keeping it inside Russia's financial system. This is a meaningful shift. For years, Western sanctions actually pushed many of these wealthy individuals to bring their money back home, since holding assets abroad became legally risky. Now, some of that same money appears to be leaving again, and this time the reported motivation is different. It is not fear of foreign sanctions. It is reportedly fear of what is happening domestically, as the state has become more aggressive about seizing assets from wealthy individuals who fall out of favor or fail to show sufficient loyalty. Whether you are a soldier's family struggling to buy fuel, a small business owner watching your supply chain get disrupted, or a billionaire quietly deciding where to park your savings, everyone in this picture is responding to the same underlying signal. Confidence is shifting, and people at every level of Russian society are quietly adjusting their behavior in response, each in their own way, each protecting what matters most to them. We are now well past the first third of this story, and I want to pause here and ask you something directly. If you have ever wondered what it actually looks like when a large, powerful system starts showing internal stress, share this video with someone who thinks wars only affect the people fighting on the front lines, because what is happening inside Russia right now proves that is simply not true. Let's dig deeper into why the fuel crisis specifically has become such a powerful symbol of frustration, because the geography of it is almost painfully ironic. Some of the regions experiencing the worst fuel shortages sit directly on top of some of the largest oil reserves in the entire world. Residents in these oil-rich regions have described watching production wells being capped, simply because there is nowhere left to safely store the extra crude up. While at the very same time, local gas stations sit empty because refined fuel cannot reach them. Imagine living in a place that produces enormous amounts of raw oil and still being told there is no gas for your car. That contradiction is exactly the kind of detail that turns an abstract economic statistic into something people feel personally every single day. That contradiction has not gone unnoticed by ordinary citizens either. Independent journalists covering the crisis have documented residents expressing open frustration in ways that would have been unthinkable. In the earlier years of the war, describing the situation using words like disgraceful and absurd. Central bank officials have even acknowledged publicly that the fuel shortage is contributing directly to rising prices across a wide range of goods and services, not just at the pump, a rare and telling admission from an institution not known for openly criticizing wartime policy. When a country's own top financial authority admits that a wartime supply problem is now driving inflation into everyday household budgets, that is not spin. That is an acknowledgement that the pressure has become impossible to fully hide. It is also worth understanding why fixing this problem quickly is so difficult. Oil refineries are not simple structures you repair overnight. They involve highly specialized equipment, some of which is difficult to source under current sanctions, and repairs can take months even under ideal conditions. Every time a facility gets close to returning to normal operations, the ongoing strike campaign creates the very real risk of another hit before repairs are even finished. That uncertainty makes long-term planning for energy companies, farmers, and everyday consumers extremely difficult, and it is part of why this crisis has dragged on for so much longer than earlier, shorter fuel shortages Russia experienced in previous years. And there is a harvest angle to this story that deserves special attention, because it connects a distant battlefield directly to something as basic as whether food makes it from farms to dinner tables. Farmers have described a very simple chain of consequences. No fuel means no harvest. No harvest means no grain. No grain eventually means less. Feed for livestock, and less feed means higher prices for meat and dairy months down the line. Agricultural experts have pointed out that crops only have a narrow window of time in which they can be safely harvested before quality and yield start dropping. Machinery that cannot get enough diesel simply cannot operate during that critical window, no matter how urgent the need becomes. This is not a hypothetical risk. Multiple reports from agricultural regions describe farmers waiting overnight at fuel depots, hoping a delivery truck will arrive before their harvest window closes completely. When you combine a shrinking supply of refined fuel with a hard biological deadline set by nature itself, you get exactly the kind of slow-motion crisis that cannot be solved with a press statement or an optimistic announcement from a government official. Now here's something that deserves your full attention, because this is the part of the story that ties everything together into one clear picture. If you have made it this far, You clearly want more than a surface-level headline, so let me ask you this in the comments after the video ends. Do you think economic pressure like this can genuinely change the direction of a war? Or does history show that governments can absorb this kind of strain far longer than most people expect? I want to hear your honest opinion. Public support for the war itself, according to independent Russian polling organizations, still sits at a majority level, generally described as somewhere in the range of 60 to 70%. This is an important detail, and it is one that many international headlines tend to skip over. The frustration we have been describing throughout this video is not, for most of the people expressing it, a rejection of the war itself. It is frustration with how the war is being managed, how resources are being distributed, and how honestly the government is communicating about the real state of affairs at home. This distinction matters enormously if you want to understand what is actually happening here, rather than what a dramatic headline might suggest. Many of the loudest voices criticizing the current situation are not calling for peace. In several documented cases, these same commentators are calling for an even more aggressive military approach, arguing that the government's problems stem from being too cautious or too disorganized, not from fighting the war in the first place. That is a very different kind of unrest than a peace movement, and it changes how we should interpret what is really happening inside Russian society right now. There is also a repression side to this story that helps explain why open criticism remains relatively rare, even as private frustration grows. Discrediting the military is a criminal offense in Russia that can carry a lengthy prison sentence, and thousands of people have already been detained on charges related to anti-war statements since the conflict began. Independent journalists and commentators who step too far outside acceptable boundaries have described serious consequences, from legal trouble to more unusual forms of state pressure. This legal and social risk explains why most criticism tends to stay carefully framed as support for a stronger war effort, rather than opposition to the war itself. Very few people are willing to risk everything by crossing that particular line completely. Before we go further, here's something worth trying yourself. Pause for a second and think about the last time you saw a government you trusted quietly change its story on something important. That small, uneasy feeling, that gap between what you were told and what you could see with your own eyes, is exactly the feeling millions of Russians are describing right now, just on a much larger and more consequential scale. If that idea resonates with you, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you think this pattern is playing out right now, because Russia is far from the only place worth watching closely. It helps to compare this current fuel crisis with earlier shortages Russia has experienced over the past decade, because the difference in scale tells its own story. Russia has faced gasoline shortages before, most of them recently just a few years ago, but those episodes were generally shorter, more localized, and easier to resolve through temporary export bans or emergency price controls. What makes the current crisis different is the sheer persistence of the pressure causing it. This is not a single supply chain hiccup or a seasonal spike in demand. It is the direct result of an ongoing military campaign specifically designed to keep damaging the same infrastructure faster than it can be repaired. That distinction matters enormously because it means officials cannot simply wait out this crisis the way they may have handled shortages in the past. As long as the strikes continue, the underlying pressure keeps renewing itself, regardless of how many emergency measures the government introduces in response. Government responses so far have been a mix of short-term fixes rather than any long-term solution. Export bans on diesel and gasoline have been extended repeatedly, restricting how much fuel companies are allowed to sell abroad in an effort to keep more of it inside the country for domestic use. Regional authorities have imposed rationing limits at the pump, sometimes restricting drivers to a single full tank within a set. Some officials have publicly downplayed the severity of the crisis, describing it as manageable or already stabilizing, even in the very same weeks when neighboring regions were introducing stricter fuel rationing measures. That kind of contradiction between official statements and the reality on the ground is exactly the kind of gap that fuels public frustration and skepticism toward government messaging more broadly. And then there's a final factor that is easy to overlook, but genuinely important to understand. Not everyone in Russian society is even closely following the war anymore. Independent polling organizations have documented a meaningful segment of the population that is simply tuned out entirely, describing themselves as no longer paying close attention to war-related news at all. This kind of quiet disengagement does not create the dramatic images of protest that make international headlines, but it plays an enormous role in how stable a government remains during a prolonged conflict. Anger can be organized and directed. Apathy is much harder to mobilize into any kind of meaningful political pressure, and that suits a government trying to maintain control far more than open opposition ever could. So if you put all of these different pieces together, what do you actually get? You get a country where fuel shortages are real and severe, where inflation is squeezing household budgets in ways that official statistics do not fully capture, where wealthy elites are quietly moving money out of the country, not because of outside pressure, but because of pressure from within their own system, where even loyal supporters of the war are publicly criticizing how it is being managed. And yet, despite every single one of these pressures, the government has not collapsed, war support remains a clear majority, and no organized political movement has emerged to seriously challenge the leadership. That combination might sound contradictory at first glance, but it actually reflects something important about how large, entrenched political systems tend to behave under sustained pressure over long periods of time. Cracks can appear in multiple places at once without those cracks necessarily connecting into something larger. A government can absorb enormous economic and social strain for a surprisingly long time, especially when the legal and social costs of open opposition remain severe enough to keep most frustration contained to private conversations, encrypted messages, and carefully worded social media posts, rather than open, organized dissent. That said, history offers a genuinely important lesson here, one that deserves real weight rather than being dismissed. Governments do not always fall because of organized opposition movements storming the gates. Sometimes they weaken slowly through a much quieter process, as the gap between the official version of events and the version people actually experience in their daily lives becomes too large and too obvious to keep papering over. When your own most loyal supporters start describing your management of a crisis using words like catastrophic or embarrassing, that tells you the official narrative is losing its grip on the very people it was designed to convince. History is full of examples where governments looked stable right up until the moment they were not. And in nearly every one of those cases, the warning signs were visible for years to anyone willing to look past the official version of events. There is also an important pattern worth understanding about who tends to become dangerous to a government during moments like this. It is rarely the people who oppose the leadership from the very beginning. Those voices are usually already isolated, already monitored, and already positioned outside the halls of real influence and access. The more dangerous voices tend to be the disillusioned insiders, the people who spent years building their careers, their public platforms, and their personal credibility by defending the system, only to become frustrated when that same system fails to live up to its own promises. Their credibility with the public was built specifically because they were seen as true believers for so long. When true believers start expressing doubt, that carries a different kind of weight than criticism from people who were skeptical from day one, precisely because their audience trusted them not to lie, and precisely because turning against the system they once defended costs them something real, both professionally and personally. Let's take a moment to think about what this pattern looks like from a purely historical perspective, because Russia's own past offers some genuinely useful context here. Long before this current war, the Soviet Union experienced its own slow, grinding economic decline in the 1980s, marked by shortages, long lines for basic goods, and a widening gap between official economic statistics and what ordinary citizens actually experienced in their daily lives. That period did not end in a single dramatic uprising. It ended through a much slower accumulation of economic strain, public disillusionment, and eventually systemic change that surprised even seasoned analysts with how quickly it unfolded once the underlying pressure finally reached a tipping point. Nobody is suggesting Russia in 2026 is a perfect replay of that earlier era. The circumstances, the leadership, and the global context are all different in important ways. But the underlying mechanism, quiet economic strain slowly eroding public confidence over time, is a pattern historians and political analysts recognize well, and it is worth keeping in mind whenever headlines try to reduce complex, slow-moving situations into single dramatic moments. If you have watched this far, you have probably noticed something important about how this story keeps unfolding. Every single piece of evidence we have covered, the fuel lines, the capital flight, the criticism from loyal commentators, the harvest disruptions, points towards strain rather than collapse. That distinction matters. And it is worth repeating clearly, because it is easy for headlines to blur that line for the sake of drama. Strain means a system is working harder than it used to, absorbing more shocks and requiring more effort to maintain the same level of stability it once managed with relative ease. Collapse means that system can no longer function at all. Right now, the evidence points firmly toward the first outcome, not the second. And any honest analysis has to respect that distinction rather than exaggerate it for the sake of a more dramatic narrative. That does not mean this story is somehow less important simply because it falls short of full collapse. Strain, sustained over months and years, is exactly how major political shifts often begin, long before anyone can point to a single defining moment and say, that is when everything changed. By the time a system visibly collapses, if it ever does, the real story usually already happened months or Here's earlier, in exactly the kind of quiet pressure points we have spent this entire video walking through together. There is one more piece of context worth adding before we move toward wrapping this up, because it helps explain why some voices are speaking out now specifically, rather than earlier in the conflict. Wars tend to enjoy a kind of grace period in their opening months and years, when patriotic sentiment, initial optimism, and a belief in quick victory tend to suppress open criticism, even from people who privately have doubts. As a war drags on longer than initially expected, and especially as it begins to visibly affect daily life in ways that are impossible to ignore, that grace period naturally erodes. 4 to 5 years into a conflict is often exactly the point where that shift becomes visible, as initial patriotic momentum gives way to accumulated exhaustion, and people who stayed quiet in year 1 start finding it harder to stay quiet by year 4 or 5. It is also worth thinking about how ordinary families experience this kind, a prolonged strain differently depending on where they live and what they do for work. A family in a major city like Moscow or St. Petersburg, while certainly affected by rising prices and occasional drone activity, is still generally better positioned to weather fuel shortages than a family in a smaller agricultural town whose entire livelihood depends on a functioning harvest season. Regional inequality within Russia has always existed, but a sustained infrastructure crisis like this one tends to widen those gaps further, since urban centers typically receive priority when limited fuel and resources are being redistributed. That uneven experience of the same national crisis is part of why frustration can simmer so differently depending on where in the country you happen to live, even while official statistics attempt to describe the situation using single, nationwide averages that often fail to capture the full picture on the ground. This regional divide also shapes how information itself travels. In major cities, state media still dominates most people's daily information diet, carefully curated and tightly controlled. In smaller towns and rural regions, where state television often feels distant and disconnected from daily hardship, word of mouth, local social media groups, and direct personal experience tend to carry far more weight than any official broadcast. That means the gap between the official story and the lived reality is not just an abstract idea. It is something felt more sharply and trusted less the further you get from the carefully managed narrative coming out of the capital. None of this means collapse is imminent, and it would be dishonest and irresponsible to suggest otherwise. Based on the evidence we actually have in front of us, Russia's government retains significant tools for managing internal dissent, from legal deterrence to state media control to genuine, still substantial public support for the broader war effort. But the pattern developing here, the fuel lines, the quiet capital flight among the wealthy, the increasingly blunt criticism from pro-war voices, and the rising public awareness of the gap between official statistics and daily lived reality represent something genuinely worth watching closely as this conflict continues into its 5th year and beyond. And that honest, careful framing matters far more than any single dramatic headline ever could. What makes this moment particularly interesting from an analytical standpoint is how many different pressure points are converging at roughly the same time. Energy infrastructure damage compounding month after month. Agricultural disruption tied to strict seasonal deadlines nature does not negotiate with. Inflation quietly eating into household budgets faster than official statistics openly admit. Wealthy elites adjusting their financial behavior in ways that suggest declining internal confidence, even while their public statements remain carefully neutral and safe. And a small but consistently growing chorus of previously loyal voices expressing frustration in increasingly public and increasingly pointed ways. Individually, none of these pressures looks decisive enough on its own to fundamentally threaten a government that has weathered sanctions, battlefield setbacks, and years of sustained international pressure already. Together, they paint a picture of a system under real and sustained strain, one that is being forced to constantly manage multiple fronts of pressure simultaneously, both military and domestic, with limited resources and increasingly limited room to maneuver, without making difficult and potentially unpopular trade-offs that risk alienating one part of society while trying to appease another. The honest and important answer to where this leads next is that nobody, no analyst, no journalist, no outside observer, can say for certain. Governments under this kind of layered strain sometimes muddle through for years, slowly adapting, absorbing losses, and successfully managing dissent well enough to remain firmly in power. Other times, seemingly manageable pressures accumulate quietly until a single unexpected event triggers a much larger and far less controllable shift. What we can say with real confidence, based on everything documented and reported so far, is that the voices of frustration are no longer confined to Russia's traditional opposition figures, who have long been isolated and monitored by the state. They are increasingly coming from deep inside the system itself, from People who spent years defending this war in public and who are now finding it harder and harder to reconcile what they see with their own eyes against what they are being asked to repeat on camera and online. That shift alone, regardless of exactly where it eventually leads, is a genuinely significant development worth understanding clearly, rather than dismissing with a simple headline or reducing to a dramatic prediction that the available evidence simply does not yet support. Here is what I want you to take away from everything we just walked through together. Wars are rarely lost or won purely on a battlefield, and they are rarely decided only by frontline casualties or captured territory on a map. They are also fought in fuel lines that stretch for a kilometer, in refineries that take months to repair after every single strike, in harvest windows that close whether or not enough diesel arrives in time, and in the quiet, careful calculations of wealthy elites deciding where their money feels safest right now. Every one of those pressures adds up slowly, and every one of them chips away, even slightly, at the story a government tells its own people about how well things are truly going. Whether this particular chapter in Russia's long history ends in meaningful, lasting change, or simply becomes another difficult period the government successfully manages and eventually moves past, one thing is already unmistakably clear from everything documented here today. The gap between the official story and the lived reality inside Russia has become too wide, too visible, and too widely felt for anyone, including the government's own most loyal and vocal supporters, to comfortably ignore any longer. If you found this breakdown genuinely useful, the best way to support this channel is simple. Hit subscribe, leave your honest take in the comments below, and share this with someone who still thinks wars only play out on a battlefield map far away. Understanding how pressure actually builds inside a country during wartime, quietly, unevenly, and often long before headlines catch up, is exactly the kind of clarity worth having, and it is exactly what we'll keep chasing here, one carefully researched story at a time.